I'm Amanda Cole, 34 years old, and last Christmas, I found myself standing on the front porch of the house I grew up in holding 2 gift bags and my children's hands while my family celebrated without us. Just a few feet away through the glass, I could see my sister's twins ripping into presents, my mother refilling coffee cups, my father leaning back in his favorite chair like this was the most natural scene in the world. Cold air slipped through the gap under the door and pooled around Harper's shoes as she whispered, "Mom, why aren't we going inside?" My son. Eli shifted his little reindeer toy from one arm to the other, too tired to ask questions, and I realized I was more embarrassed for them than I had ever been for myself. My mother opened the door with that familiar polite smile and said, "There just isn't enough room for you and the kids this year, honey. Maybe next time." And in that moment, something in me went very still, like a door closing quietly somewhere deep inside. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever felt like there was never quite a seat for you at your own family's table, hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. I wasn't always the woman left standing on the porch. At least, I don't think I was. Growing up, my parents loved to talk about how important family was, how holidays were sacred, how we took care of each other no matter what. Sunday dinners were a big deal in our little South Carolina neighborhood, and my mother would line the table with pot roast green beans and her famous sweet potato casserole, telling us this was what real family looked like. Back then, I believed her. I believed that if you worked hard, stayed kind, and did your best to help, there would always be a place for you in the room. From the outside, our house never looked like much, but it was warm and busy and full of noise. My dad worked long hours at an auto shop, my mom picked up shifts at a local boutique, and Renee and I shared a bedroom with a peeling floral ceiling and mismatched beds. We didn't have much money, but we had routines: Friday night pizza, Christmas ornaments made from popsicle sticks, birthday cakes from a boxed mix with way too many candles melted into the frosting. My parents made sure we knew the value of stretching $1 and the importance of saying thank you, even when the gift came secondhand. I carried those lessons with me, tucked away beside the belief that family might be imperfect, but it was solid. As we grew older, little cracks in that picture began to show, though for a long time I refused to name them. Renee seemed to slide effortlessly into the role of golden daughter, the one invited to help my mother pick out table linens, the one my father bragged about to customers, the one whose school awards were framed and hung in the hallway. I was the quieter one, the helper in the kitchen, the extra set of hands who set the table and cleared the plates. When college and jobs and marriages came, the gap between our lives widened in ways that had nothing to do with love on paper and everything to do with how much room we each took up in my parents' world. Renee's life, her husband, her kids, her in-laws, her plans seemed to expand across every conversation, every photo wall, every holiday. My own path twisted a little more. I married young, moved away to North Carolina, and spent years trying to balance motherhood work and a marriage that quietly wore down at the edges. Daniel and I had a decent house, steady jobs, and a life that looked respectable enough, but there was always a sense that I was just managing, just keeping things together with lists and late nights. Through it all, I still called home, still tried to bring the kids back for holidays, still bought thoughtful gifts, and sent photos of school plays and Halloween costumes. When my marriage finally broke apart, it wasn't a dramatic explosion, so much as the slow realization that 2 exhausted parents, living in different emotional worlds, couldn't keep pretending they shared the same one. Coming back to my hometown with Harper and Eli felt like a chance to land somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. I told myself my parents would be that safe place. I told myself that even if they didn't always understand my decisions, they knew I worked hard, that I loved my children more than anything, that I was doing the best I could with what I had. I imagined Sunday dinners again, only this time with my kids running around the backyard, my mother slipping Harper an extra roll at the table, my father teaching Eli how to toss a football in the front yard. Instead, I moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a stubborn radiator, while my parents talked about how proud they were of Renee's new house in the suburbs, big enough for everyone, they said, without ever quite including us in that everyone. The contrast between their world and mine was suddenly sharp. her roomy home and steady husband, my chipped countertops, and secondhand furniture. By the time that Christmas rolled around, I had a modest job at a marketing firm and a handful of freelance clients that kept me up late after the kids were asleep. Money wasn't easy, but the bills were paid, and there was always food on the table. What there wasn't that year was a tree in the corner of our living room or a pile of wrapped gifts spilling out from under it. I'd spent weeks telling myself that what mattered most was being together, that we would go to my parents' house and the kids would see their cousins and we'd all sit around the same table just like old times. I baked cookies from scratch in our tiny kitchen, wrapped small presents in careful paper, and loaded everything into the Carhartt, pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. So when my mother opened that front door, blocking the warm light with her body, while the sounds of laughter and clinking silverware floated past her shoulder, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Harper's question why we weren't going inside hung between us like a breath no one wanted to take. My mother's explanation came wrapped in soft words about space and numbers and how things just got a little crowded this year. But the meaning underneath was clear. There was room for Renee's kids, for her husband, for his mother, for neighbors and church friends, and whoever else fit the picture they wanted to present. There was just not enough room for me and my children. I stood there for a beat too long, cheeks burning in the December air, and finally turned back toward the car, the weight of two small hands in mine and a question forming quietly in my chest. If there was never going to be a place for us at their table, what exactly was I still waiting for? The drive back to my apartment that night was unusually quiet, broken only by the soft rattle of Eli's reindeer toy every time the car turned. Harper sat behind me looking out the window toward the scattered Christmas lights along the street, the reflection of blinking red and green moving across her face. She did not speak again about the porch, and I let the silence stay between us, the kind that fills a car when everyone is holding their breath in their own way. When we reached home, the building looked colder than usual, its brick exterior catching the glare from the street lamps, and for a moment, I sat in the driver's seat, trying to gather myself before unbuckling the kids and shepherding them upstairs. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than it had earlier that morning. I helped Harper pick out pajamas, tucked Eli under his blanket, and listened as his breathing settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. Harper's question lingered in the doorway as I turned off her lamp, but she did not ask it again. After the kids were down, I walked through the living room, pausing where a Christmas tree might have stood if December had gone differently. I sat at the kitchen table, pulled my phone closer, and read the message Renee had sent about stopping by tomorrow for leftovers, the words floating on the screen without any sense of warmth or welcome. I set the phone aside and sat at the table until the hum of the refrigerator became the loudest sound in the room. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how similar moments had been collecting over time, small enough on their own to pass as misunderstandings, but heavy enough to gather meaning when placed side by side. I remembered a birthday dinner the family hosted for Renee months earlier, one I learned about only after seeing photos online of a restaurant booth filled with smiling faces, none of which were mine or my children's. My mother later said they figured I had work that night and did not want to bother me with changes, though I had told her earlier that week that my schedule was open. When she explained it, she did so with an easy tone, as if leaving me out was a minor detail easily dismissed. There was also the retirement party they held for my father, a small gathering filled with neighbors, old coworkers, and extended family. I saw the pictures on social media the next morning, my mother standing behind a round cake covered in chocolate shavings, while my father held a framed plaque. Friends commented about how wonderful the night had been. I had not been invited. When I asked my mother later, she said it was spur of the moment, though the decorations and platters in the photos suggested otherwise. She apologized with a short smile, the kind meant to smooth everything over, without actually acknowledging anything that hurt. Another time was a family barbecue at Renee's home, one she had planned with her husband to celebrate their twins' first day of kindergarten. Judging from the group photo she posted, the yard was full of cousins and relatives I recognized from my childhood people who had known me by name. Under the picture, she had tagged everyone present except me, and though the omission might have been brushed off as a slip of the finger, it was not the first oversight. When I asked about it, she said she assumed I was busy with the kids or my freelance work. It was always an assumption, always a reason that seemed harmless, until it pressed up against the memory of standing outside her front door years earlier, waiting for someone to open it. Small things accumulate when no one pays attention to them, and over time they begin to draw a line that becomes hard to ignore. I tried to rationalize each moment, telling myself families get stretched thin, that plans change, that communication gets messy. Still, something in me shifted when I realized these moments formed a pattern I had been stepping around for years without naming. I was present for every milestone they celebrated publicly, but absent from the ones they shared privately. I brought dishes to events when invited, sent cards when I could, shared photos of my kids when asked, and yet I hovered at the edges of every gathering like someone waiting to be acknowledged. The turning point came in a quiet moment one rainy afternoon. Harper had fallen asleep on the couch with a sketchbook open beside her, a drawing of a house she had colored in with bright markers. It had a red door and a wide porch, the kind with space for chairs and long strings of lights. She had written "Home" over the roof in big block letters, and under it 3 figures holding hands. I stood there looking at it and felt something tighten, not from sadness, but from a kind of clarity. I realized that if I kept accepting a place on the outskirts of my family's celebrations, my children might grow up believing that was normal. I wanted them to feel wanted, not tolerated, to know that a home was more than a roof. It was a place where their presence was welcomed without condition. I kept working and saving, taking on more freelance clients in the evenings and weekends. The apartment was small, but it held us steadily during that first year back in Charleston. I spent late nights at the kitchen table drafting logos, building websites, and writing copy for small businesses that could not otherwise afford outside help. The extra income helped fill some gaps, though it also meant sleeping fewer hours and finishing more cups of lukewarm coffee than I could count. My job at the marketing firm remained steady, and over time I managed to take on larger projects that tested my creativity in ways I had not expected. My boss began to recognize the work I put in and pulled me into meetings I had not attended before. It felt like stepping into a room I had always wanted to see. During this time, my parents remained polite but distant. They asked about the kids during short phone calls, though. The conversations rarely went deeper than school updates or quick questions about doctor visits. They asked about my work only when the silence became noticeable, and even then the questions sounded more like formality than interest. I answered what they asked and kept the rest to myself. The distance settled into something predictable, not warm but not hostile, just a quiet stretch of road we all kept walking without looking either direction. Meanwhile, Renee continued building her life with the confidence of someone used to being centered. Her texts came occasionally, usually brief updates about the twins' photos from school events or questions about holiday plans. I responded when I could, though our conversations rarely drifted beyond surface topics. She occupied a place in my parents' home I no longer recognized, and though I did not resent it, I no longer pretended it meant more than it did. As the months moved along, I noticed the ways my small circle outside my family had grown. Mrs. Hill often stopped by with fresh bread or a handful of magazines she thought Harper might like. The Millers would wave from across the street and offer to help carry groceries up the stairs whenever they saw my hands full. Lauren sent voice messages filled with encouragement during the tougher weeks. These gestures were simple, yet they formed something steady beneath me, a different kind of foundation I had not expected when I first returned to Charleston. I held on to those small connections as I worked toward something larger. One night in early fall, after a long day at the office followed by 2 hours of freelance edits, I closed my laptop and looked around the apartment. Toys were lined up along the wall, drawings were taped to the refrigerator, and a stack of client folders was spread across the table. I wondered what it would take to find a place where all of this could fit without feeling cramped. I wondered what it would take to give Harper the red door she had drawn and Eli the space to line up his toy trucks without worrying about piles on the floor. That thought stayed with me long after I turned out the lights. As evenings grew cooler and the days shortened, I began to think about what the next holiday season would look like. I did not have an answer yet, but I felt the edges of one starting to form. There was a sense that something had shifted not just in my circumstances, but in how I understood them. I did not know what would come next, but I knew I would not stand on another porch waiting for someone to make room for us again. Something had to change, and for the first time, I felt ready to find out what that meant. The weeks after that rainy afternoon settled into a rhythm I could manage, though the apartment always felt a little smaller once winter set in. Mornings began with Harper's footsteps down the hallway and Eli's sleepy voice calling from his room. I helped them get ready for school, packed lunches and tied shoelaces while the coffee pot filled the air with its steady hum. Those early hours held a kind of calm that made the rest of the day possible, the kind that gave me enough breath to keep moving when the hours stretched long. At the marketing firm, the season brought a rush of campaigns, and I found myself spending more time at my desk, pulling ideas together for clients preparing for the new year. The office was busy, but there were moments when the sunlight came through the windows just right and made the room feel lighter. My boss stopped by more often asking for quick thoughts on designs and inviting me to sit in on meetings I had never been part of before. Each small step added to something steady, something I could lean on when I returned home to the apartment filled with toys, coloring books, and the sound of children settling into evening routines. At night, after brushing the kids' teeth and tucking them into bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a notebook to sort through freelance work. Some nights were heavier than others. I adjusted website layouts, edited social media captions, and tried to meet deadlines while the dishwasher hummed beside me. The hours stretched, but the work kept me grounded. I liked the quiet moments when I could hear the radiator start up or the neighbor's dog bark faintly 3 floors down. They reminded me that even when the day felt long, the world kept turning in small, steady circles. Every now and then, Harper wandered out of her room to show me another sketch she had drawn, sometimes of a house with a red door, sometimes of a porch lined with lights. She placed each drawing on the refrigerator, lining them up beside her school art projects until the door was covered. Eli added his own contributions, mostly scribbles and dinosaurs taped in uneven rows that made him smile when he walked into the kitchen. Their artwork brought something warm to the apartment, a touch of color that made even the smallest corner feel lived in. One Saturday morning, after finishing a freelance project earlier than expected, I decided to take the kids to the farmer's market near the waterfront. The sky was clear, and a light breeze carried the smell of fresh baked bread and citrus from the stands. Harper held my hand while Eli clung to his stuffed reindeer, both of them weaving through the crowd with bright eyes. We sampled peaches, browsed handmade soaps, and stopped to watch a street musician play an old guitar. The kids swayed gently to the music, their shoulders relaxing in a way I had not seen in a while. It was a morning filled with small joys, the kind that return to you later when you least expect it. On the drive home, Harper asked if we could stop by the park for a little while. I agreed, and we found a spot under a cluster of tall oaks where she could draw in her sketchbook and Eli could run across the playground. I sat on a bench nearby, watching them play with the ease that comes when children feel safe and unhurried. The afternoon sunlight drifted across the grass, and the air carried a quiet hum of laughter from families scattered across the park. I watched Harper sketch a small house with wide windows and a long dining table that stretched across the page. She turned the book toward me when she finished and said softly, "This is for Christmas someday." Her words lingered as I packed up their things and loaded the kids back into the car. They floated alongside me while I navigated the familiar streets toward our apartment building, passing rows of homes with porches decorated for the holidays. The thought settled in, slowly moving from the edges of my mind to the center as I parked the car and carried the kids' jackets upstairs. It was not a decision yet, but the shape of one was starting to form. Later that week after work, I found myself walking through a neighborhood I did not usually visit. I had taken a detour to clear my mind and ended up on a quiet street lined with older homes, each with its own personality. Some had wraparound porches, others had tall shuttered windows or brightly colored doors. A few were decorated with wreaths or strands of lights that glowed softly in the early evening. I slowed my pace, taking in the way the houses seemed lived in and cared for even in their imperfections. One home in particular caught my attention. Its paint had faded, and the porch light leaned slightly to one side, but something about it drew me in. The house had a wide front porch and two large bay windows that faced the street. A tall red door stood at the center, its color muted by time, but still striking against the pale siding. For a moment, I paused on the sidewalk, looking at the house with the same quiet curiosity I felt when Harper showed me her drawings. There was a for sale sign tucked into the grass beside the walkway, its corners lifting slightly in the breeze. I did not take any steps toward the house. I simply stood there, noticing the way it seemed full of stories, the kind of place that could be brought back to life with effort and love. After a while, I continued my walk, though the image of the house stayed with me long after I returned to the apartment and settled into my evening routine. The days moved forward, and as I worked through upcoming projects at the firm, the idea of something new began to settle into a more defined shape. At first it felt distant, like a daydream tucked behind bills and school schedules, but by the end of the week, it was harder to ignore. I told myself I was only curious that looking at houses did not mean buying one, but each time I glanced at Harper's drawing on the refrigerator, the red door seemed brighter than before. One afternoon after finishing a meeting, I checked my phone and saw a text from Lauren asking if we could catch up over dinner. We met at a small restaurant downtown with old brick walls and soft lighting. She asked how work was going and how the kids were adjusting, and I told her about the promotions at the firm and the steady freelance clients. When she asked how I was feeling about the holidays this year, I paused before answering. I told her I was still figuring it out, though part of me wondered if I was already farther along in that process than I realized. She nodded and told me she admired how I kept moving forward even when things got hard. I appreciated the support, though I did not say much more. The evening ended with a warm hug in the parking lot and a promise to meet again soon. As I drove home, the image of the red door returned once more, steady and clear. That night, after the kids were asleep, I opened my laptop and began searching for listings in neighborhoods I liked. Some houses were too expensive, others too small, but I kept scrolling, letting the possibilities settle in without forcing anything. When I saw the house from my walk listed at a price slightly above what I felt comfortable with, I hesitated before clicking the details. The description mentioned original heart pine floors, a dining room with wide windows, and a yard large enough for children to play in. It also mentioned that the home needed some work, which did not scare me. If anything, it made the idea feel more within reach. I closed the tab before I could convince myself to schedule a tour. Instead, I sat back and listened to the apartment settle for the night, the radiator clicking and the street noise fading. The space felt familiar, a place that had held us when we needed somewhere steady. Still, the thought of a home with room to grow lingered, quiet but persistent, as if waiting for the right moment to step forward. I kept returning to the house, listing over the next few days, opening it on my phone whenever I had a spare moment. The photos showed sunlit rooms with tall ceilings and floors worn smooth by years of living. Even though the paint was chipped in places and the yard needed attention, something about it held my focus. I thought about the way Harper had traced her finger across the picture of a red door on her sketch, and how Eli had nodded when I showed him a house with a porch wide enough for rocking chairs. The idea of a home no longer felt like a distant dream, but something gradually taking shape. By the following week, curiosity finally outweighed hesitation. During my lunch break, I called the number listed on the sign and scheduled a tour for Saturday morning. When I hung up, I felt a quiet mix of anticipation and nerves settle in my chest. I told myself it was only a visit, nothing more, and that looking did not obligate me to anything. Still, the thought stayed with me throughout the afternoon as I worked through emails and prepared for the next client meeting. Saturday arrived cool and bright. I loaded the kids into the car, buckled them in with their jackets still zipped, and drove toward the neighborhood with the listing pulled up on my phone. Harper pressed her face against the window as we turned onto the street, lined with old oaks and tidy front lawns. When the house came into view, she sat up straighter and whispered, "That's the one with the red door." Eli bounced in his seat, pointing at the wide porch with interest. The real estate agent, a woman named Cheryl, who appeared to be in her early 50s, with a soft voice and calm demeanor, greeted us on the sidewalk. She unlocked the front door and stepped aside so the kids and I could enter. The moment we walked in, a gentle draft carried the scent of old wood and something faintly sweet, like the remnants of a candle that had once filled the space. Sunlight poured through the large windows, casting warm stretches of gold across the floor. Harper walked slowly along the banister, sliding her hand along the rail with quiet concentration. She took in each detail with wide eyes, pausing at the base of the stairwell, as though she could already imagine herself climbing it each morning. Eli toddled forward into the dining room, giggling as the light hit him just right. He turned in circles, his small footsteps echoing softly off the heart pine floors. Cheryl led us through each room, explaining the age of the house, the materials used, and the updates it would likely need. I listened carefully, absorbing her words one by one. The kitchen had a long counter that could easily fit 2 stools for breakfast, and the dining room looked large enough to hold a table that could comfortably seat 12. The bedrooms upstairs were cozy, each with its own view of the neighborhood trees swaying gently outside. When we reached the final room, Harper tugged gently at my sleeve. "It smells like Christmas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood quietly for a moment, hearing the faint hum of traffic outside and the soft creak of the house settling under our feet. Something in the space felt familiar, even though it was entirely new, like a place waiting for its next chapter. 3 weeks later, after several meetings with the lender and careful planning on my part, I signed the papers. The moment the keys touched my hand, everything seemed to shift into focus. I walked out of the office holding the small ring of keys, feeling the weight of them against my palm. The kids waited for me in the lobby with a book and a bag of snacks, unaware of the milestone that had just taken place. When I told them we could now call the house ours, Harper's eyes widened, and Eli clapped with excitement. The first afternoon we spent in the house was filled with the echo of our footsteps and the sound of boxes sliding across the floor. I opened the windows to let fresh air in, and the breeze carried the scent of pine needles from the neighboring yard. I walked through each room, running my hand along the walls, imagining where furniture could go and how sunlight would move across the floors through the seasons. When I reached the dining room, I lingered longer than any other place. I pictured garlands draped along the mantel candles glowing on a long wooden table and the sound of quiet conversation filling the space. Later that week, I told my parents about the purchase. My mother paused before responding, her voice carrying a hint of controlled surprise. "Isn't that a bit much for you right now?" she asked. "With your situation and all?" She lingered over the last few words, letting them settle like a gentle reminder of the limits she believed I had. My father offered a quick, "Just make sure you've thought everything through," without asking any questions. Renee texted a short message later in the evening that read, "4 bedrooms." "That sounds ambitious. Hope you can keep up with the upkeep." I read each message with care, but I was already too focused on settling into the house to let their doubts take root. Days turned into weeks as the house slowly began to reflect our lives. I worked on small repairs after the kids went to bed, peeling back old wallpaper and sanding down baseboards. The paintbrush became a familiar weight in my hand, and the scent of fresh paint filled the rooms one by one. Harper chose a soft lavender for her bedroom, and together we painted the walls until the whole room felt calm and gentle. Eli picked a shade of green with dinosaurs on the border, and he spent every evening running toy cars across the drop cloth on the floor. I set up my home office in a small room overlooking the backyard, the light pouring in just right to brighten my workspace. Each morning, I organized my tasks while the kids ate breakfast at the kitchen counter, and at night, I returned to that room to finish freelance work with the window slightly open to catch the cool breeze. By the time November arrived, the house no longer felt like a project, but a home. Harper taped her artwork along the refrigerator door, lining it with watercolor flowers and colorful drawings of houses. Eli's toy trains rested along the edge of the hallway, their small wheels catching the morning light. The dining room held the refinished table I found at a thrift store, its surface smooth after hours of sanding and staining. One evening, as I stood in the doorway of that dining room, I felt something shift inside me, not from memory, but from possibility. The long wooden table stood ready for people to gather, and the red door at the front of the house felt like an invitation waiting to be given. It occurred to me that the holidays were only weeks away, and for the first time in a long while, I was not preparing to go anywhere else. A few days later, while brushing Harper's hair before bed, she asked Mom who's coming to Christmas this year. Her voice carried a quiet hope, and I listened closely as I worked through the tangles in her hair. I paused for a moment before answering, letting her question settle. I realized then that I no longer wanted to recreate the holidays I had grown up with. I wanted something different, something warm, steady, and welcoming. That night after the kids fell asleep, I sat at the dining table and made a list not of gifts or groceries, but of people. I wrote down names of those who had shown up with kindness, who had helped carry groceries, offered rides, or brought comfort on the hardest days. I thought about each one and how they had shaped our life in small yet meaningful ways. When the list reached 10 names, I set the pen down and looked at the room around me. The idea had taken shape steady and sure. It wasn't a plan yet, but the direction was clear. Christmas this year would not be spent waiting on a porch. It would be spent behind the red door of the home we had worked so hard to create, surrounded by people who made room without being asked. The list I made that night stayed on the dining table for 2 days before I returned to it. Each name carried a memory of a small kindness that had steadied me during the past year, and looking at them together made something inside me feel grounded. I read through the list slowly, imagining how each person might react to an invitation for Christmas dinner. As I reached for the pen again, the idea began to feel less like a wish and more like a plan I could shape with my own hands. One morning after dropping Harper and Eli off at school and daycare, I sat in my home office and researched options for holiday catering. I told myself I was simply gathering information, though the thought of serving something special at our table made the idea feel even more complete. As I scrolled through local chefs, one name caught my eye: Chef Marcus Hale. I recognized him instantly from old conversations with Renee once, where she had mentioned dining at his restaurant and how exclusive his bookings were during the holidays. She had mentioned once that he rarely took private events, especially in December. That detail stayed with me as I dialed the number listed on his website. His assistant answered with a professional tone, explaining that the chef's calendar for December was full. I thanked her politely, ready to end the call, when she added that she could double-check his availability if I was flexible with timing. The unexpected offer made me pause. I told her I was open to whatever date worked, and she promised to return my call later in the day. When I set the phone down, I sat quietly, aware that waiting carried its own weight. I tried to focus on work, though my thoughts drifted more than once. That afternoon, as I prepared a campaign draft for a client, my phone buzzed. The assistant's voice held a different tone this time. She said that the chef had reviewed the request and was willing to take on one more private event, provided it fit within his schedule. She asked whether I wanted to move forward. I agreed, trying to keep my voice steady. She described the menu options, each one sounding more refined than the last, and when she finished, she said he would be honored to cook in my home. I thanked her, hung up, and sat back in my chair as a quiet sense of certainty spread through me. It was happening. Not in pieces, not someday, but now. The next step was writing invitations. Instead of printing them, I chose to handwrite each one at my dining table. I took my time with every envelope, including a simple message about gathering for Christmas, sharing food, and spending time together. I mentioned nothing complicated, only that seats were ready and that their presence would mean a great deal. When the last envelope was sealed, I held them together in a neat stack, aware of how much could change with just a few cards dropped into a mailbox. As the days moved toward Christmas, the house began to reflect the season. Harper helped me hang garland along the banister, her small hands carefully arranging each piece. Eli insisted on placing the wooden reindeer figurines across the entry table, lining them up in a little parade he adjusted each morning. The living room filled with soft lights, and the scent of cinnamon drifted from the candle Mrs. Hill had given us earlier in the month. The house felt different, not just decorated, but lived in with intention. On Christmas morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as I set out the good dishes I had purchased on sale earlier in the month. The table looked warm with soft linens, flickering candles, and polished silverware. Harper smoothed each napkin carefully, while Eli placed small ornaments beside every glass as decoration. Their excitement filled the room in a gentle way, neither loud nor frantic, just steady and full. At 2:00, the doorbell rang. Harper darted toward the entryway, and I followed close behind. Lauren stood on the porch with a bottle of wine and a smile that reached her eyes. She stepped inside, taking in the lights and decorations with a soft expression. Minutes later, Mrs. Hill arrived with a tin of cookies wrapped in red ribbon. Tom and Andrew came next, carrying a wreath dressed with pine cones and small white lights. Each arrival filled the room a little more, their voices blending together in a warm hum. In the kitchen, Chef Hale and his assistants worked with quiet precision, the aroma of herbs and roasted vegetables drifting out into the dining room. When he stepped forward to announce the first course, the room fell into a gentle hush. Plates filled with thoughtful flavors were passed around the table, and conversations eased naturally into stories and laughter. No one asked uncomfortable questions. No one whispered about things left unsaid. The only sounds were the clink of silverware, Harper's soft giggles, and the low hum of jazz playing in the background. After dinner, we moved into the living room for games and hot cocoa. Harper challenged Andrew to a card game while Eli curled up beside Mrs. Hill with a half-finished cookie in his hand. Tom played a quiet melody on the piano that filled the space with a peaceful rhythm. I stood near the fireplace taking in the scene as the lights cast a soft glow over the room. At one point I reached for my phone and took a few photos. The table set with care, the kids laughing in the kitchen, a group photo where everyone lifted their glasses toward the camera. I posted them to my social media account with a simple message about gratitude and togetherness. I didn't think much of it. It felt natural, something I wanted to remember. As the evening wound down, Harper curled against my side on the couch, her eyes heavy with sleep. Eli had already drifted off in Mrs. Hill's lap. One by one, our guests gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, hugging me, before stepping into the cool December air. Chef Hale packed his equipment and thanked me for the invitation, leaving the kitchen spotless. When the last set of footsteps faded down the porch steps, I closed the door gently and stood in the quiet. The house still carried the warmth of the day, a softness that lingered in the spaces where laughter had settled. As I carried Eli upstairs and tucked him under his blanket, I felt the weight of the holiday shift into something lighter. It was the first Christmas in years where I had not waited outside someone else's door. I had opened my own, and people who cared for us had walked through it without hesitation. Downstairs, I checked my phone before heading to bed. It buzzed with notifications from the post I had made earlier. Among them was one message from a number I recognized immediately. It was from Renee. The text preview showed only a few words, but they were enough to still the air around me. I opened the message slowly, the quiet around me deepening as I read her question. It wasn't anger that washed over me first, but something colder and more familiar. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand, aware of how the day had unfolded and how different it had been from years past. I set the phone on the counter and turned out the lights one by one, leaving the house in a soft glow. Upstairs, Harper called for me, her voice carrying through the hallway. I walked toward her room, ready to end the day on a gentle note, aware that something had shifted and that the next days would bring their own changes. I found Renee's message the same night the last of the guests stepped out into the cool December air. The kids were already tucked in, and the house had settled into that peaceful quiet that comes after a long day of company. I stood at the kitchen counter with the phone resting in my hand, reading the few lines she had sent. Her words were short, but they carried enough weight to make me pause. She asked whether the photos I had posted were really taken in my home and whether the chef in the background was truly Marcus Hale. The questions were direct, but the edge beneath them felt sharper than the words alone suggested. I didn't reply. Not then. I turned off the kitchen lights, went upstairs, and helped Harper straighten her blankets where she had kicked them loose. She reached out for my hand, still half asleep, and whispered goodnight. Eli stirred slightly in his room, but didn't wake fully. When I walked back down the hallway, the weight of Renee's message remained, though it did not settle as deeply as messages from the past once had. I set my phone on the nightstand and decided to let the night close on its own. For the next 2 days, the house held onto the scent of roasted herbs and cinnamon. I moved through each room, picking up stray napkins and returning ornaments to their boxes. Harper talked about how she wanted to invite all the guests again next year, while Eli asked whether he could draw pictures for the next dinner. Their excitement filled the house with an easy warmth, and for a time, everything felt steady. Then on the 3rd day after Christmas, a car pulled into the driveway while I was sorting laundry in the hallway upstairs. I heard the tires crunch on the gravel and looked out the bedroom window in time to see Renee stepping out of her car. She held a small gift bag in one hand, her coat pulled tight around her. She walked toward the porch with a determination that made the air around the house feel suddenly still. I met her at the door before she had a chance to knock. She looked past me into the entryway, taking in the garland still hanging along the banister and the soft lights that glowed around the door frame. Her eyes lingered on the living room for a moment before settling back on me. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door behind her and led her to the living room. The house was quiet. Harper and Eli were upstairs playing, and the afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a gentle glow across the hardwood floors. Renee placed the gift bag on the coffee table, but didn't move to sit. Instead, she crossed her arms and looked around slowly, as if she were taking stock of what she saw. "This place looks nice," she said, pausing as she searched for the right word. "I didn't realize you had done so well for yourself this year." I nodded, not offering more than that. She took another quick glance toward the kitchen, her eyes landing on the small stack of dishes drying on the counter. "I saw the photos you posted," she continued. "Was that really Marcus Hale?" "The Marcus Hale?" "It was," I said. She let out a sharp breath caught somewhere between disbelief and frustration. "Do you know how many times I tried to book him for Mom's birthday? He never had availability." I didn't answer. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "Posting those pictures so publicly, it made us look bad, Amanda. People at church were talking. Mom has been upset for days." I listened, letting her words settle before responding. "I posted pictures of my home and my friends. That's all." "That's not all," she said quickly. "You know how it looked. You know how people talk. It felt like you were trying to send a message." "Renee," I said gently, "I hosted Christmas in my own home. That's the only message." She stared at me, the tension in her shoulders stiffening. "You're really mad about one Christmas, aren't you?" The quiet in the room stretched long between us. I heard the faint sound of Harper's laughter drift down the stairs, and for a moment I let that soften the edges of the moment. Then I looked at my sister. "It wasn't one Christmas," I said, "and you know that." Her face shifted, the defensiveness fading just enough to show something else: uncertainty, maybe even regret. She lowered her gaze and took a slow breath. "Mom feels humiliated," she said after a moment. "People asked her why you weren't with us." She didn't know what to say. "She can tell them the truth," I said softly. "There wasn't room for us." Renee didn't argue. She pressed her lips together and sank onto the couch, her posture easing slightly as though she had been carrying the conversation on her shoulders alone. "We haven't been fair to you," she said quietly. "I know that." She paused, her voice thinning. "But this felt personal." I sat across from her, resting my hands on my knees. "This wasn't about making anyone look bad," I said. "It was about choosing something that finally felt right." She looked toward the kitchen again, her expression softening as she took in the quiet space. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice steadier now. "You didn't lose me," I replied, "but I needed to step back from the parts of our family that kept pushing me out. I couldn't keep pretending it didn't affect us." Renee didn't speak right away. She folded her hands in her lap and looked down, absorbing each word slowly. A long breath left her chest as she nodded. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "Respect," I answered simply. "Not guilt, not forced invitations, just respect." She looked up again, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something in her eyes that felt close to understanding. If we tried, if we showed up differently, would there be room for us someday, she asked. I took a moment before responding. "If you come with sincerity, not convenience, then yes," I said. "But I'm not opening the door to things staying the same." Renee nodded her shoulders, loosening as though she had been holding that question longer than she realized. She placed her hands on her knees and stood slowly smoothing her coat. "I'll try," she said. I walked her to the door. As she stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch. She paused before walking to her car, offering a small, quiet smile that hinted at something new, though not yet certain. After she left, I stood on the porch for a moment, letting the cool air settle around me. Upstairs, Harper called my name, her voice drifting through the open window. I turned back into the house, aware that the conversation with Renee had shifted something important, though the shape of it was still forming. I walked up the stairs toward the sound of my daughter's voice, ready to step into the next part of the story that was unfolding, aware that change often comes softly before it becomes clear. After Renee left that afternoon, the house settled into an unusual quiet, the kind that follows a conversation you know will shift the days ahead, even if you're not sure how. I walked up the stairs toward Harper's room, still hearing the distant echo of my sister's footsteps leaving the porch. When I reached the doorway, Harper was sitting cross-legged on her rug, arranging colored pencils into neat lines. She looked up when I stepped inside, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Was that Aunt Renee?" she asked, tilting her head. "It was," I said, settling beside her. "Is she okay?" Harper's question was soft, as if she was afraid of the answer. "She's learning," I said gently. "Sometimes that takes time." Harper seemed to consider that, nodding to herself before returning to her drawing. She didn't push further, and I didn't add more. Some truths didn't need to be spoken all at once. The next few evenings were calm. Harper and Eli went back to their usual routines, building forts in the living room and taking turns decorating the windows with paper snowflakes. I returned to freelance work once the kids were asleep, though my thoughts drifted now and then to the conversation with Renee. She had left with a promise to try, and while I didn't know what form that would take, the honesty in her voice had settled somewhere steady inside me. 2 days later, I received a text from my mother. It came in the mid-afternoon while I was reviewing campaign drafts at my desk. The message mentioned the kids first asking if they were well, then suggested that she and my father would like to see them sometime soon. The final line hinted at doing something for my birthday, though nothing was said about Christmas or the conversation with Renee. It hung in the air like an unfinished sentence, one that avoided the deeper truth. I didn't respond right away. I finished my work, picked up the kids from school and daycare, and prepared dinner as usual. Harper helped set the table, lining up the silverware carefully, while Eli arranged napkins in uneven stacks. Their voices filled the kitchen in that lively way children have when they feel safe, and I let myself enjoy the warmth of it. Later that evening, after both kids were in bed, I opened the message again. I read it slowly, aware of what it said and what it didn't say. Then I typed a reply that felt steady and clear. "The kids are doing well. Our days are full. If you want to reconnect, it needs to begin with honesty and respect. I'm no longer accepting anything less." I sent the message and set the phone down. No reply came that night, or the next morning, or the afternoon that followed. The silence lingered, but it didn't feel heavy in the way it once might have. It felt more like a pause, one I was willing to hold without filling it for someone else's comfort. As the days passed, I noticed something new taking shape around me. My home had become a place where people stopped by without hesitation. Mrs. Hill arrived with a small container of soup for the kids one rainy evening, saying she made too much. Tom and Andrew helped me install a new light fixture in the hallway after noticing the old one flickered. Harper's art teacher, Ms. Rowe, sent a note home offering to give Harper extra time after school to work on watercolor techniques since she had shown such interest. These gestures, small and steady, wove themselves into the fabric of our days. One afternoon, as Harper and I decorated the kitchen for her upcoming birthday, she paused while taping a banner along the wall. She looked at the glittery invitations scattered on the table, and then at me. "Mom," she asked, "do I have to invite everyone?" "Does someone make you uncomfortable?" I asked, meeting her eyes. She nodded slowly. "The cousins, they're always mean." I crouched beside her, smoothing the edge of the banner where it curled. "You don't have to invite anyone who makes you feel small," I said. "Not for your birthday. Not ever." Her shoulders relaxed, and a small smile spread across her face. She picked up a fresh sheet of stickers and went back to decorating. Eli joined her, adding crooked stars to anything within reach. As I watched them, something settled gently inside me. I wasn't just trying to rebuild my own footing. I was showing my children what it meant to create a life that didn't shrink around the expectations of others. Over the next few days, the house became lively again. Harper practiced greeting her friends for the party, lining her stuffed animals along the hallway as pretend guests. Eli pretended to be the party helper, wearing a dish towel across his shoulder and carrying small toys back and forth between rooms. Their energy filled every corner of the house, turning it into something bright and lived in. One evening, while I folded laundry in the living room, I heard Harper call from her bedroom. "Mom," she said as I stepped into the doorway, "is it okay to say no to people even if they're family?" Her voice held no fear, only curiosity. "It's more than okay," I said. "It's important." She nodded once, as if confirming something for herself, then returned to arranging her books. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the simple conversation settle into my chest. As the week continued, the silence from my parents remained. They did not ask about the message I sent, nor about Christmas, nor about the photos that had prompted Renee's visit. I didn't reach out again. The absence felt different this time, less like a loss, and more like a doorway I didn't need to walk through unless there was genuine effort on the other side. On Friday afternoon, I opened the front door to find a small package on the porch. It wasn't from my family. It was from the Millers. Inside was a small hand-painted ornament shaped like a house with a red door. Attached was a note that read, "For your first Christmas here. Glad to have you on the street." I held it for a long moment before hanging it on a branch near the top of the tree. As evening settled, Harper and Eli played quietly under the soft lights in the living room, their laughter drifting through the house. I leaned against the doorway, watching them build a fort from pillows and blankets. The home we had created felt full, not only with noise and warmth, but with the sense that we were moving toward something steady and hopeful. I didn't know yet how the coming days would unfold. I didn't know whether Renee would follow through on her promise to try, or whether my parents would respond to the boundary I had set. But as I watched my children fall into easy laughter, I felt the strength of the life we were building, one where love didn't need permission and where respect was not something borrowed. The next chapter was waiting, and I could feel it rising quiet and sure just beneath the surface of our days. In the days that followed, the house settled into a gentle rhythm again. Harper's birthday invitations were taped neatly to the fridge. Eli's drawings lined the hallway, and the soft glow of the tree filled our evenings with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The silence from my parents remained, but it no longer felt like a wound I needed to tend. It was simply space room for something honest to grow someday if they chose it. For now, the quiet suited me. It gave me time to see the life around me with clearer eyes. One afternoon, while Harper worked on a watercolor project at the kitchen table and Eli napped on the couch, I received a call from Chef Marcus Hale. His voice carried the same calm professionalism I had heard before, and he asked if I wanted to reserve Christmas again for the following year. I found myself smiling as I walked toward the dining room. The table stood in a patch of sunlight, the wood warm beneath my hand as I rested my fingers against it. I told him yes, and he added that he had already made a note to include Harper's favorite glazed carrots and a small set of s'mores for Eli. After we ended the call, I stayed by the table for a long moment, listening to the quiet house and thinking about how far we had come. As winter moved toward the new year, our circle grew in ways I hadn't expected. Mrs. Hill began stopping by every Thursday for tea, bringing stories from her younger days that made Harper giggle and Eli clap with delight. Tom and Andrew helped me clear branches from the yard after a windy night, their laughter rising over the sound of the rake. Lauren visited with her daughter on weekends, filling our living room with blocks and crayons and the kind of playful noise that never felt overwhelming. It surprised me how naturally these connections settled into place, like the house had been waiting for them all along. Harper noticed it too. One night before bed, she asked if people could be family, even if they weren't related. I told her yes, and she smiled in that soft way she did when something made sense deep down. She said she liked our kind of family better, then tucked her stuffed rabbit under her arm and fell asleep, as if the world finally felt safe to her. A week later, my mother sent another message. It was brief, asking again about seeing the children, though nothing was said about my earlier words or the boundaries I had set. I read it, then placed the phone face down on the table. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel the old pull to explain myself or make things smoother. I simply knew that the next steps had to come from them, not from me. Growth wasn't something I could do on anyone else's behalf. The turning point arrived quietly. Harper's birthday fell on a mild afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and warm. The Millers came early to help hang streamers. Lauren brought a tray of cupcakes with soft blue frosting, and Mrs. Hill arrived with a wrapped present for Harper and a second one for Eli, so he wouldn't feel left out. The house filled with gentle voices and children's laughter, and for a moment I stood near the staircase watching it all unfold. This was what I had imagined for years, a home with room for joy, a room where my children were not overlooked or hushed, but welcomed with open arms. Later that night, after everyone left and the kids were tucked in, I walked through the house turning off lights. The dining room still carried the faint scent of frosting and candle wax, and the remains of the party decorations swayed softly in the warm air from the vent. When I reached the porch, I stepped outside and let the cool evening breeze brush across my face. The red door stood behind me, its color glowing softly under the porch light. I thought about the porch I used to stand on, the one where I waited year after year with gifts in hand and hope in my chest. I thought about how small I had felt then, how carefully I had learned to fold myself to fit the spaces I was allowed. And now here I was on my own porch, one I didn't have to ask permission to enter, one with a table inside that stretched wide enough for every person who cared to show up with kindness. Renee reached out again a few days later. Her message was thoughtful, acknowledging the ways she hadn't seen things clearly before. She didn't ask for forgiveness or for things to go back to how they were. She only said she wanted to try to be someone I could welcome in good time. I told her we could take things slowly, step by step. There was no rush. Real change rarely happens all at once. As winter settled fully, and the last of the holiday lights came down around the neighborhood, I felt something inside me ease. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest. I no longer felt the need to chase a place at a table that had never truly been set for me. I had built my own solid, warm, and surrounded by people who showed up without being asked twice. If there was one lesson I carried forward, it was this: love that requires shrinking is not love at all. Real love expands. It makes room. It invites you to sit, to rest, to breathe freely. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is step away from the doors that will not open and build a new one with our own hands. If my story reminds you of a time you had to make space for yourself, I'd love to hear it. And if you're listening tonight feeling like you're still standing on someone else's porch, I hope you'll stay for more stories. And remember, you deserve a table where you never have to ask for a seat.